Now I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Don Duet, chairman and founder of Concourse Labs. Don is an accomplished leader in successfully developing and executing business and technology strategy. Don spent 28 years at Goldman Sachs, during which time he held senior leadership roles in technology globally. Additionally, Don has been an active and vocal participant in the open source and open standards communities, including acting as the founding board member of the Open Compute Project. Now, I turn it over to Don, and for today's topic, getting control of policy as code.
Thank you, Mary, and welcome to everybody who's joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and thanks for the introduction, Mary, of both the topic and myself. So this is the third of our sessions that have really focused on how we help people with thinking through, based on our own experiences, with the design and the implementation of security as code programs. And as Mary said, we're seeing in the enterprise marketplace, with the tremendous growth in cloud adoption, the substantial usage and movement really into multi-cloud hybrid computing as the standard approach that many companies are taking, that security as code has become almost the de facto way of actually ensuring that controls can be managed and supported in a world that's more complex, more agile, and changing all the time. And so what we're trying to do in this series is to help people understand, at least understand our perspective on how you can build and support the creation of a security as code program for your business, and hopefully be very successful in this migration towards security as code programs in helping you with your cloud adoption. So that said, what we do each of the sessions is we just start a little bit with just a reminder of what we're defining security as code to mean, since there's a lot of jargon and different people may have different perspectives on it. But we think ultimately that security as code distills down into three fundamental tenets for any company that's looking at creating a security as code program. The first and most obvious is that it's about code. It's about writing code that instantiates the declarative artifacts that become representative of your control, so they can be run autonomously, they can be run scalably, and that they represent the definition of what you believe are the right set of controls and configurations that make up your risk posture for operating business in the cloud. That's number one. The second is that in order to implement security as code and really provide for that, it requires therefore a process of formalizing what are your concepts and security objectives, and then bringing them into what we will define as we go into this deeper as the policies that really represent the control objectives that you have, that can therefore be made into code, and you can actually represent them in a way that programmatically implements those objectives. And so that part of really formalizing the security posture, the ability to bring kind of all your objectives of control into what becomes an inventory of control objectives and policy, is a super important part of, we think, a security as code program. And then lastly, we very much see security as code as following a lot of the basic value propositions that the world has seen, and hopefully your institution has, of really standing on the shoulders of DevOps and infrastructure as code movement. So being able to support automation, being able to support the democratization, and getting more people involved in your security programs by enabling ultimately participation to occur on a broader basis, with oversight and management by your risk and control teams. So that's how our definition is. And as we go into the program, we'll talk more about each one of these as we think about the context related to today's topic. The big question, of course, I think this is increasingly takes less effort to explain for many people, is why. Why is security as code needed? Why do many institutions now start to have started to really expect and really kind of design their own cloud management strategy around the concept of security as code? A couple of major drivers that we've seen. First and foremost, that we see that the ability to have software has become agile. Agile software and the use of the cloud has really been the driving factor for much of cloud migration and adoption, to get innovation cycles faster, to be able to support the ability to allow developers to build solutions rapidly. So we see that, therefore, from a security perspective, just means more surface area, more change. Second, change has increased in velocity and increased in breadth. So not only are you having changes that are occurring more frequently for your applications, they're occurring over a wider set of services, as the amount of services you can offer your clients and your internal users and developers through the cloud catalogs has just broadened. And of course, the cloud providers are all looking to innovate and create new services that create more value, that adds to the pile, that increases the rate of change. So change is the second most important piece. Third is just infrastructure from a control perspective. So really shifting the concept of where controls are implemented from historically the firewall into what becomes really software defined, whether it be perimeters to run and operate your services, whether it be configurations of how services are deployed and constructed, that there's a fundamental shift away from hardware-based approaches to software-defined solutions, which again, really drives the construct of security as code. From security and risk perspective, we also see a lot of companies, as we mentioned, the cloud provides massive federation, massive democratization. And therefore, what we see as the effect of that, there are just more people that are involved now in the security and risk programs because more people are involved in the actual creation, maintenance, and management of software assets. And so the movement from a highly centralized to more decentralized has been a core part of most people's cloud journey and adoption. And the same is true, we believe, increasingly for risk and control, of enabling more people to be participants in that control program. It creates value. It enables more self-empowerment. It enables organizations to become more fluid and agile collectively. And then lastly, in terms of why we see this adoption of security as control programs as a necessity for managing hybrid multi-cloud, is this change of control plane from being mostly about people doing manual tasks, security reviews, et cetera, to ultimately the need for automation, just given, as we said earlier, the velocity, the physics of the amount of changes, and just the overall surface area increasing. So really moving that control plane from being a human-based process into something that can be distributed, packaged, and then deployed consistently across your organization. So controls and the effectiveness of controls can become substantially more distributed through your security as code program. So these are all the back drivers behind it, which again, we're seeing increasingly recognition in industry and across both our clients and people that we're working with in the open communities, that the adoption of security as code programs is becoming now kind of a default behavior for most companies. But what is a good security as code program? As we said, this webinar session, or these webinar sessions, plural, have been designed to hopefully articulate at least what our perspective is. We did our second session focused in on accountability and ownership. We think there are three principal pillars of a good security as code program. The first being really ensuring that you're designing a approach to RBAC and ABAC that really supports the ability to build accountability and ownership. To learn more about that, please go back and watch, if you haven't, the second webinar session that really dug into that in detail. The second, which we're going to spend time on today, is really this aspect of how do you support just this growing corpus of new IP, all these pieces of security as code that you're building over time. How do you make that trustworthy? How do you ensure that it's effective? How do you deal with just the own scale and complexity that it brings to your organization? So that's going to be the center of our conversation. And then in the next episode that we'll be providing, we'll really talk about how you now take both the ownership model, take the management model, and take the ability now to really integrate controls deeply, both downstream into your your software change management processes, into directly your CI/CD approach, and then also, from a truly kind of, complete protection perspective into your runtime, both preventatively as well as detectively. So we'll cover that in our next session. But as I said today, our focus is going to be principally on the security as code program itself and how you can help develop a security as code program, which, to manage the actual software assets that you're going to be building. And I'll just say it again, because I think it's just, super important that we see this as a new IP base that really resides, whether it be physically alongside, but logically alongside your business application software base, and has, incredibly important value to your company. In some ways, you could argue that your security as code becomes as important, if not more important, than the code that it's protecting, right? Because ultimately, if you're going to be relying on security as code to be the ability to both prevent bad things from occurring and be your first point of awareness of potential risk, that code is going to be incredibly important. So as we go into this session, we're going to talk a lot about that, how we think about designing and modifying those controls. So first, when we think about kind of the basic components of this program, excuse me one second, just trying to move something around here. really, identifying first the discrete problems that need to be solved. So what does the code need to do, which really comes back to, do we know what our control objectives are? Have they been able to be brought in a way that's literate enough that we can actually explain what we're going to do? And then how do we take that across all the different forms of services and cloud capabilities that we want to protect against? Second is really defining and mapping that backwards, so that not only do you have the ability to say, I've written code that really implements different security policies, but I can actually step back and understand what its intent was. I can measure that intent over time, that I don't get lost in the complexity of trying to understand which software was written for which purpose. That association we're going to spend quite a bit of time on, as we see that as a very important value proposition, and from an architecture perspective has been one of the most important pieces that has led to either success or failure in the security as code programs that we've observed. And then, of course, actually writing the policy itself, which is its own discussion. This conversation is not going to be about specific policy languages at this point. Hopefully, in a future session, webinar session, we can get into the depths of that. But then, lastly, how do you manage that inventory as codified IP? So these are the major components we think about in this section that we're going to talk about today. And from our experience, working with clients, as well as our own experiences of our teams, having worked in the enterprise for many, many years, we really think that the most important thing with the security as code program is to think about fundamentally how are you going to manage the potential and reduce the risk of what we call security as code chaos. And as Mary said in the very beginning, as you start to imagine at an enterprise scale, having many, many different people that are involved, increasingly larger number of people involved in your security programs, an increasing large amount of code that needs to be written and managed, and an increasingly amount of risk, because the trust that you need to have in those controls and the effectiveness of controls only increases as you drive the automation. That ultimately, we've seen as a failure mode is where if you don't think enough and design enough for how to manage that comprehensively, that we see many places where the security code program ends up failing because people lose trust in it, that they either don't understand what it's expected to do or how it's expected to do it, or they don't believe that it can be verifiable. And that's a big challenge for many people. So as we look at this, we really divide it, think about the ability to say, how do you build a trustworthy security as code program? And we think a major part of that is having a design that really starts with comprehensively thinking about the problem space and then focusing on how to solve for this potential of chaos. And we start with on the implementation side. So do we have the ability to bring into what becomes, effectively real kind of first-class data and managed information? What are the different contexts that I want to apply policy for? We can apply policy in many cases for, things like dev versus prod. We may have different policies for different types of risk assets, or may have different policies for different points of view, whether it be regulatory, whether it be internal control driven, et cetera. And so there's a whole aspect here of context. We'll talk more about that as we go into it, but really being able to bring context as almost a first-class citizen to how we think about our security as code program is essential, so that we can really help dimensionalize what the policy objectives are across a number of different business contexts that we may have. And many businesses are going to have quite a degree of diversity in the sense of what types of contexts they will need to want to apply policy for. And again, ultimately bringing that as to, much directly up into part of the design process and the implementation stage is been super important in helping move that forward. Of course, you have to have policy. You have to apply that policy to the cloud, but also what are the segments of your cloud? So for many enterprises, the cloud is a word. It's going to be broken down into different CSPs, different providers. Within each provider, it may be driven down into how you think about ownership of accounts, landing zones, et cetera. So really being able to also bring not just the context of your policy, but also what component, what segmentation, what are the micro segments of your cloud that policy is going to be applied to, what is its jurisdiction over, is essential, again, to maintain that and build that and design that into your security as code program so you can manage the complexity of policy. Third, the ability to ensure that you can track the policy enforcement over time. So ensuring that what policy is being executed, when was the last time it ran, how do I know that it's run successfully? These are sound pretty simple and straightforward, but as we see with many people, that once you get beyond a certain number of policy as code that you're operating, that just it just gets hard to collectively ensure that you have the right, that you have the right integrity of your control and your enforcement of controls, and without having automation and solutions that can help support for that. And then lastly, how do you think about the ability to determine your policy and its performance? How do you have the ability to know which policy is working correctly and which one's not? So these are all important parts of how we think about the management side of the policy plane. On the life cycle side, all policies will have their own life cycle. So every piece of code is going to be changed over time, whether it be the provider changing, whether it be your control objectives changing, whether it be the code implementation itself needing to change and adapt. And so we really need to ensure that we're also designing into our approach the ability to have a consistency around how we're going to operate and run the life cycle of policy. And from our perspective, that starts first and foremost with just having the ability to write good policy. So that policy, whatever language it's authored in, we believe strongly needs to be very specific and very comprehensive. One of the challenges that we see in the market is that policy that's written that's too broadly stated just generates a lot of noise, can create a lot of false positives, that can lead to a lot of toil that takes people away from being able to focus on real risks. It generates friction because there's a view that maybe the security program isn't really designed well and doesn't truly understand the needs of the business. So we see this ability to really build targeted policy that can understand both the complexity of cloud and cloud services that are related, but also to bring that in the context that understands your own applications and your own systems design is important. So a big part of our focus is how do we support the ability to enable complex policy to be simply managed, because you'll have a lot of them and you want them in a form that's going to be as consistent as possible so that the implementation of policy can be fairly low cost, but also very, very targeted to the actual needs that you have in your business. Secondly, all this needs to be in a enterprise published and inventory. So having the transparency and the visibility across what are all the policy implementations that have been constructed, who are the owners of those, who are the authors of them, they may have come from different sources, where do they reside today, all these aspects really to get to an enterprise inventory ledger of the policy content that you have and you maintain is critical to knowing in managing the life cycle policy and policy change. The third major piece in the life cycle that we're going to talk about is maintaining an audit trail. So how do you know what's changed when, who changed it? Is that change been redeployed into where it's supposed to be going, or is that change sitting in more of a draft state that has not yet been released? These are no different to how we would think about software in general, business application software and its own release, maintenance, and audit trail life cycle. Those same requirements become necessary for policy and providing them again in a way that has visibility and it's going to be very important in maintaining the trust and the trustworthiness of your security as code program. And then lastly, what we do find as well is that having the ability to have the historical data and historical record of how your policy has operated, how it's been changed, what it's been changed for, is essentially very important, not just in being able to enable you to manage it better, but also in the design of new policy, that the ability to go back and understand over time as risks change in the external world, that you can do things like test new policies against historical content to find how you can improve policy over time. So this, we see a very virtuous cycle here of having the ability to have these enterprise capabilities around policy is important, not just in maintaining the lifecycle management of the individual code, but also in the generation of new policies as you continue to expand your risk posture and refine what you're doing. So that's the way we think about it. When we step back, what we really see here is that we believe that institutions that are going to really look to operate and run a strong security as code program are going to need to contemplate all these aspects of both the implementation side of the program, how they're going to manage, and then the life cycle, how are they going to support the ability to ensure that as they grow their policy content, that it's designed in a way that meets the context that they have, it meets the aspects of the control objectives that they're looking for, that it is easily understood and trackable, and that it's highly targeted to reduce mistakes. All of this we see as really requiring or certainly benefiting from an integrated life cycle where this is looked at comprehensively and managed in a way that you can have an enterprise trust in your overall policy and security as code programs in your company. And this is really represents the way we think about this at Concourse and the way we've seen it successfully. Companies being able to implement strong broad and meaningful enterprise security as code initiatives and convert them into an actual working solution that allows them to run their business and continue to grow and expand as they move into cloud more broadly. It's a lot of concept, so I wanted to spend some time in the session as well to just talk about some real kind of examples. So one of the most important aspects when we start with security as code implementations is we really start with that formalization. So most companies do have today, or and most companies have had historically, a catalog of what their controls are that represents, in their company, that these are the controls they're looking to standardize on. That control often sits in their second line of defense. That control catalog usually today sits in a spreadsheet. So one of the major pieces of the equation that we've helped bring is to take it, that content out of the spreadsheet to bring it directly into the management and the digitization layer on your security as code program, so that you really start with the concept of there's a catalog or a collection of catalogs that you're looking to build that will really drive your business. So your cloud policies start with the concept of a catalog. The catalog will represent the control objectives that you have. And as we go through this, we'll see how this really creates an integrated life cycle around everything we've discussed for security as code. So from that control catalog, we can very easily start to step into that and look at it comprehensively and begin to say, well, what are the different contexts? Are there regulation contexts? Perhaps some components of your catalog will be related to specific regulators that you may work with. They may be related to different forms of jurisdictional standards. They may be driven by application types or different forms of risk types. So the catalog supports the ability to bring not just, this is my collection of controls, but this is how these controls were shaped by underlying objectives that we may have that can span, multiple different forms of my business objective perspective. And this context is very important as we step into now, how do you think about implementation of these policies into the actual control policy? So how do I associate collectively, these objectives of control into what becomes ultimately the controls that have been codified into my policy implementation? And in order to do that, what we support is that ability to take this level of context down now into the various forms of controls that are backing this up, that actually make the requirements for something to exist, and then the association of what policy, which code is actually running in your environment that will relate to the implication of that would ultimately be the code that's going to give you the answers back as to whether this particular policy objective is being met or not being met. So again, from an integrated perspective, bringing that together, as well as bringing together the ability to manage risk. So being able to see from the catalog down to the individual objectives of control that I have, through to the implementations of policy, and then even down to the findings. So where am I having findings with my policy? How can I mark and measure that? And then again, how can I walk that back from where I have a violation? What is it from? What is it impacting? What control objective? What particular context? That really creating this linkage and this ability to bring these together just yields tremendous value in the ability to both to measure risk and to manage risk, identify who needs to be involved in the resolution of these problems and risk, but also making it transparent so that different groups in your team can have access to this based on the visibility you want to be able to provide. But it gives us that ability to cut straight through. The control objective, the policy mapping, I shared this slide here just because I think it's really indicative of, as many of our clients, as they start to work through this process of effectively, taking the control objectives they've historically worked with and then really materializing them down into what are the policy objectives that ultimately will be implemented, that process is iterative. I mean, that process is something which you'll probably be doing, over time in many different ways. And it's certainly, going to be one where a single, policy objective may have, multiple implementations of policy. In this case, what we're showing here is that from the perspective of policy, we may have a set of blast radius principles from an architecture perspective, but we want to make that separate from the way we think about trust boundaries within our container. So creating the specification of what becomes ultimately the policy that your developer and your DevOps teams will see becomes much more definable, and therefore the implementation of those policies in the code that's created is also better structured and zoned. But this is all needs to be designed for with the basis of you'll be continuously improving, continuously changing, expanding, refining this. It's something which becomes part of the life cycle that we think is important to manage, but to manage with the assumption of change throughout. And the last piece I wanted to cover from a kind of examples, is really this concept of, how do you not only bring your own catalog, how do you create your own over time, living document of what your policy objectives are and what those translate down into policies, implementation of policy, et cetera, that we see increasingly, that the opportunity to really bring and incorporate multiple points of view of catalog and control is extremely necessary for the security and risk team. So the ability to bring second party content, you may be working with a system integrator, you may be hiring different firms to help build out part of your content and policy objectives to bring that so that it can become, ultimately managed in the same way consistently across, policy that's first party. That means you wrote it yourself in your own company. Second party, where you're buying it from a third party, buying it for someone else. And then, third party content, which comes from different sources, could be coming from the CSPs themselves. So, Google Blueprints or Amazon well architected, bringing all those types of policy objectives down to their implementation, and then supporting the ability to manage that comprehensively at scale is a huge value proposition for many companies. Most people want to and will benefit from having the ability to have many different opinions of control. Nobody has complete ownership of what is right or wrong when it comes down to policy. Having the ability to simply and safely incorporate many different perspectives and even build your own perspective, leveraging existing standards and third-party information and third-party points of view becomes very empowering as customers, and as people really look to build a comprehensive control program. So these are some slides. They're just examples, but we think that they will help illustrate the fact that moving this whole comprehensive life cycle into an integrated architecture can create a tremendous amount of benefit. So from a key takeaway for this section, first and foremost, I think what's most important to just almost come back to is just that your security as code program is going to live or die by how well you can keep trust in it. And so the ability to ensure that it's doing what it's supposed to do, that it's well documented, that it proves that it's effective, and that it manages across all the change that's going to come, and it can scale to all the aspects of the size and usage of the cloud in your company is just absolutely essential. And so that's point number one. In order to do that, having a unified platform that provides visibility and control is essential, just given the amount of content. Avoiding that cloud chaos from having the content overwhelm yourself and your team is the objective here. Getting continuously auditing of the usage and effectiveness. One of the biggest challenges for people is having code that they're assuming is working but isn't, or having the assumption that silence means no failure when there is. So having even the capabilities to ensure that you're continuously testing code independent of how it's running. So ensuring that it has a test and fail condition. So knowing that if you're not getting a message back, if it's not creating a violation, that's because it's still passing the test objectives. Third, just getting the multi aspects of first, second, and third party content into a single program that can really amplify the value and help you build rapidly by leveraging other expertise, and including, again, cloud provider content is fantastic. And then lastly, just making sure that these controls really need to be done in a way that it reflects the fact that you need a federated approach to cloud, that you want to maintain to the extent you can an enterprise perspective that can help centralize the awareness, visibility, and automation, but that there are going to be many people and many different needs, and every business has tremendous diversity. And so your policy as code program may sound really simple when it starts, but often will, and in most cases is going to become substantially more complex as it's embraced broadly and deeply into your organization. So that was our seminar from today. I'm going to hand it back to you, Mary, now to see if there's any questions.
Well, thanks, Don. We have several questions here that have come into the chat. So I'm just going to start with the first one is, I have applications and systems on Azure, Oracle, GCP, and on-premise. Does this tool support all of these platforms from a single pane of glass?
Yeah, so I think we try and support all the cloud providers for sure. So like whether it be Oracle, GCP, Azure, AWS. And again, when I say support, we support both the concepts of how do you look at, the ability to build policy that can be operated in the build time, so Terraform or other, forms of kind of declarative artifacts that may be used as infrastructure as code, as well as in the runtime. So we'd be happy to talk more about that. We don't necessarily support, I would say, on-premise. I think the challenge with many cases with helping people with on-premise policy is just getting access to data and getting the information that enables us to be able to evaluate. But it's certainly something which we've talked to different firms about, and we're absolutely not adverse to looking at ways, again, to extend our roadmap to support different aspects of on-prem. But the ultimate objective is to try to get as close as possible to a single pane of glass, because as we've seen in the industry, that most companies have moved pretty quickly towards a multi-cloud hybrid architecture. You can't forget what exists on-prem. It has to be incorporated. So your control objectives in your catalog should span at the minimum, what your on-prem versus, as well as your kind of in-cloud control objectives are. Wiring that all down. I wouldn't want to say that we do everything for everybody, and as on-prem is probably the one where we need the most discussion, with individuals on. But it ultimately is really the objective here, is to try and get to where you can manage policy across your hybrid capabilities and your hybrid usage.
Okay, second question. Do you have a control catalog for ISO 2700X?
We have a number of control catalogs that we've built based on different industry standards, and ISO 27, I believe, is one of them that we have. That's, that if we don't, we can confirm that. But, what we've been able to do using our own technology is really rapidly develop control implementations for policy, in the same way that as we're working with clients, many of them will start with things like a catalog like the ISO catalog, or a catalog like CIS, or different aspects of CSA and NIST, which we provide. And they'll start out of the box using those, but then they'll pretty quickly start to move towards where they want to, ultimately build their own content. So that first party, content creation we see happen fairly quickly, but we absolutely, provide a number of different capabilities to bootstrap that from a from different industry standards perspective.
Okay.
Good questions.
Yeah, a couple more. How do you manage these catalogs under change from AWS?
So that's a great question. And so, it would probably be a long answer to really answer that one completely. But what we do is everything that we do when we look at policy implementation starts with the perspective of ultimately that it's policy over the type system, or the declared systems of the cloud provider. So AWS will have a version, GCP will have a version, Azure will have a version. When we build policy, we're building the policy, or the policy implementations that are being created are being done over the actual version of the cloud provider. So at the policy level, when you think about policies and control objectives really should be immune from these types of version conversations. But when you step down into the policy implementation, it absolutely needs to know what version of AWS was I written for, if I'm AWS policy, what version of GCP, et cetera. And so we support that ability all the way down through the implementation. We'll know the version that it was provided for. So as providers continue to change their own versions, we can tell which policy needs to be re-reviewed, which policy was written for a prior version, may have a change in it that needs to be looked at. So when we think about the lifecycle management of policy, we didn't cover this specifically in the slides, but one part of that is this change cycle from the providers themselves, and really facilitating to make that a more automated process where you can be, if you're the owner or the author of some of the policy implementations, that you'll be kind of notified when there's a change to the underlying version that it was built on for the underlying cloud provider who actually, who the policy is related to. So we do support a lot of that. Again, something we'd love to spend more time on, if there's interest.
Sure. Okay, and do you scan the deployed resources to see if policy is still enforced or configuration drifted? Where do you track the drift?
Yeah, so I mean, drift is a word that's used a lot, and there's obviously different perspectives, on that. So one view of drift is, I will build effectively policy objectives that relate to how I, for example, may want different services to be configured. Perhaps, virtual machines should have these types of controls, and I don't know, storage accounts could have those types of controls. So we support that. And then you could think of drift, or sometimes drift is framed back as like, do I have things in my runtime environment that don't match that? So that's something we can absolutely do support today. There's a different version of drift, which is increasingly, I think, growing, which is more about when I'm writing software and I'm building my infrastructure as code artifacts for that software. How do I know that what my code repo would say is the actual kind of expected behavior or expected outcome versus what is actually happening in my cloud? So did somebody, by design, after I put in place my controls to check when I committed my code into my Git repo that it's been good, and then I did my checks when I published it through my CI/CD process that it's still good, but did somebody come over the top or under the covers, depending how you think about it, into the runtime and modify? So drift can also become, how do I compare my source repos to the actual running instances of those assets in the cloud? And again, that's another definition of drift, which we also can show you how we support as well.
Well, great. Thank you, Don, for the session. And I think that's all the questions for today. Just as a wrap up, we will make this session recording available to you, and we would love to get your feedback. I've sent a link in chat to tell us what your thoughts are. There was a question about, will we make the PDF of the slides available? And we haven't been doing that, but it's of course a great idea. So let us get back to you on that, and we'll let you know. And I want to thank everyone for attending, and we hope to see you in the next session. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.